Years after the fall of the Empire, Luke Skywalker wandered the galaxy in search of texts about the ancient Jedi Order. His journey took him to forgotten temples, ruins buried by time, and libraries hidden on isolated worlds. He sought to understand the lost secrets of the Jedi Order, deepen his knowledge of the Force, and perhaps find answers to past mistakes. It was in one of these explorations that he came across a set of scriptures far older than anything he had ever read. The fragile pages contained techniques and teachings that seemed beyond anything he knew. One of them caught his attention immediately, an ability that allowed a Jedi to project himself anywhere in the galaxy without physically leaving where he was. The description of the technique was impressive. The Jedi could manifest from a distance, like a Force ghost, but without being dead. This projection wasn't just an illusion. He could interact with his surroundings, cross physical obstacles, and maintain a connection with the Force as if he were present. Luke had never heard of anything like this, not even in the old holocrons. If that were true, then the Jedi of the past held knowledge that had been completely lost during the wars and the fall of the Order. His heart raced at the prospect of mastering something so extraordinary. But if this technique had been forgotten, was there a reason for it? Perhaps it was dangerous, perhaps it required a great sacrifice. Intrigued and overwhelmed by the desire to understand this skill, Luke decided to practice it. He began his attempts in the old Jedi structure where he had taken refuge, a quiet and secluded place ideal for deep meditation. For weeks, he devoted himself to the technique with all his Jedi discipline. The first few days were frustrating, nothing seemed to happen. He felt the Force around him, but couldn't shape it in the way described in the texts. Still, Luke persisted. He knew that any Jedi skill required patience, focus, and absolute mastery of the mind. Over time, he began to feel something different during his meditations. A slight separation between his body and his consciousness, as if part of his essence was moving beyond reality itself. Then, one exhausting day of training, something changed. After hours of deep meditation, Luke opened his eyes and, to his surprise, saw himself sitting in the same place. For a moment, he thought he was having a vision, but soon realized that it wasn't just a delusion. He looked down at his hands and, apparently, they were normal, but when he tried to touch them, his fingers simply passed through each other as if they weren't there. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that he had succeeded. He was outside his own body, but not as a Force spirit. His projection didn't have the blue light characteristic of deceased Jedi. This was something different, something unique. To test the technique further, Luke decided to get moving. He walked through the small Jedi temple and confirmed that he was completely intangible. His form passed through walls and objects without any resistance. But at the same time, he realized something unexpected. The Force was still flowing through him with complete normality. This meant that, even in that state, he could use his abilities. To test his theory, he concentrated on a book on the table. To his surprise, the object began to levitate gently, as if it were being manipulated by his physical body. The discovery was astonishing. He could interact with the world, even when he was out of his body. The potential of this technique was vast and terrifying at the same time. Luke continued to hone the skill over the next few days. Over time, he realized that he could project himself to greater and greater distances, as long as his concentration was absolute. He experimented with visiting different locations without ever moving his physical body, just his consciousness traveling through the Force. There were no apparent risks to his body, as long as he was in a safe place. However, a side effect began to emerge. Every time he used the technique for too long, he felt intense mental fatigue. His body became weaker and exhaustion was visible. This made him reflect on the limits of this ability and why it had been lost over the centuries. It wasn't just a question of power, it was a question of responsibility. As he mastered the projection, Luke began to understand the possible implications of his discovery. In the wrong hands, this technique could wreak uncontrollable havoc. Someone trained enough could snoop on secrets from any corner of the galaxy, influence events at a distance, and perhaps even interfere in battles without ever being physically present. The ability challenged the very concept of presence and identity. It was then that Luke understood why some Jedi techniques had been kept secret. Not all knowledge should be accessible to everyone. He felt honored to have discovered it, but he also knew that he carried a burden with this power. One night, while meditating, Luke found himself reflecting on the past. He thought about Tatooine, what had happened to him, and, above all, to his father. What would it have been like if some choices had been different? If Anakin had followed a different path? If someone had managed to prevent him from turning to the dark side? These thoughts began to occupy his mind more frequently. He wasn't looking for an answer, just allowing himself to imagine the possibilities. However, as he reflected, he felt the force around him vibrating differently, as if it were responding to his questions in a subtle and imperceptible way. During one of his projections, something unprecedented happened. As usual, Luke went into deep meditation and concentrated on a familiar place, the house where he had grown up on Tatooine. When he opened his eyes, he expected to see the inside of the Jedi Temple where his physical body was, but instead he found a completely different environment. The scorching desert heat was unmistakable. The fine dust that danced in the air, the sound of the wind cutting through the dunes, everything was incredibly real. He was standing in front of his old childhood home, but something felt different. Not just the landscape, but the energy around him. For the first time since mastering the projection, he felt a strange weight in his chest, without understanding exactly why. Before he could understand what was happening, something caught his eye. Outside the house, an unknown woman was watching the horizon, looking worried. Luke frowned, trying to recognize her face, but he didn't have time to think. A boy ran past him and the woman's voice echoed in the air. "Anakin!" Luke froze in place. His heart raced. It didn't make sense. He wasn't just projected onto Tatooine. He had crossed time. Luke was standing in front of his own father, still a child. The shock of seeing him so small, naive and full of life was greater than he could have imagined. He concentrated and could feel the force flowing through Anakin in an intense way, stronger than in any other being he had ever met. Even compared to Darth Vader, that energy seemed even purer, without the shadows of the dark side. Luke remained still for a few seconds, absorbing the moment he had never imagined he would experience. He was seeing his father before all the pain, before the war, before the fall. It was a vision that was both beautiful and melancholy. His gaze then turned to Shmi Skywalker, his grandmother, who was chatting quietly outside the house. He had never had the chance to meet her, and now he saw her there, alive and radiant. For a moment, he was amazed, not knowing how to react. Shmi noticed him and kindly said, "Hello, can I help you?" Luke felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that interfering in that time could bring huge changes to his present, especially when it came to his own family. It was a huge risk, and for a moment he thought about simply disappearing and ending the experiment right there. But then a thought entered his mind. He wasn't there by chance. Perhaps the Force had plans for this encounter. If his projection had brought him there, perhaps there was something that needed to happen. Taking a deep breath, he decided to go with it and approached. "Yes, my ship broke down. I've been told there's a boy here who can help me." Shmi looked at him curiously, but before she could answer, Anakin excitedly stepped forward. "What happened?" Luke smiled slightly when he saw the boy's enthusiasm. "I'm having trouble with the deflector shield." Anakin was thoughtful for a moment and answered naturally. "If you like, I can take a look. I can get the parts for you." Luke was amazed by Anakin's liveliness, innocence, and goodwill. "Can I go with him, Mom?" asked Anakin anxiously. But Shmi, with a gentle look, replied, "It's lunchtime, my son. Then you can go." Luke watched the scene, feeling a different warmth in his chest. This was the Shmi Skywalker he had never had the chance to meet. A woman with a warm gaze, who emanated a silent affection. Then something unexpected happened. Shmi looked at him with a sparkle in her eyes, as if there was something familiar about him. It was as if she already knew him, even though she had never seen him before. Without knowing why, she smiled and said, "Do you want to come in?" Luke felt a lump in his throat and, thrilled, replied, "Of course." As he entered the Skywalker's house, Luke felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew this place better than any other in the universe. It was where he grew up, where he spent his childhood with Owen and Beru, Every corner of that house brought back dormant memories, memories that now seemed even more distant. The smell of hot sand mixed with the dry air of Tatooine was unmistakable, and for a moment he almost forgot that he no longer belonged there. Shmi invited him to lunch, but he knew he couldn't touch anything. "Thank you for your kindness, but I've just had lunch." Shmi smiled as she served Anakin and, watching Luke curiously, asked, "Where are you from?" He looked around, taking in the familiar house and, with a restrained smile, replied, "I'm from Naboo." Anakin, curious, leaned forward and asked directly, "Are you a Jedi?" Luke arched an eyebrow, surprised by the boy's perception. "Why do you ask me that?" Anakin pointed to Luke's waist. "I saw your saber. Only a Jedi has such a powerful weapon." Luke laughed lightly, increasingly impressed by his father's intelligence and insight. Then, looking deeply into Anakin's eyes, he replied with a firm tone, "Yes, I am a Jedi." After a pause, he added, "Just like my father." Shmi raised her eyes to Luke, intrigued by the different look on his face when he said those words. She didn't know why, but there was something about him that fascinated her. Anakin, excited, replied without hesitation, "I want to be a Jedi too." Luke took a deep breath, trying to contain his emotion. "You're intelligent," and he paused and smiled. "The Force is strong in you." Anakin frowned. "The Force? What's the Force?" Luke leaned forward slightly and, with a serene tone, explained, "The Force is what creates life, makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us and unites us. It is the basis of a Jedi's power." Shmi listened attentively, enchanted by Luke's words. There was something about the young man that made her feel safe and deeply respected. Then Shmi realized that he still hadn't told her his name. "You didn't tell me your name." Luke hesitated for a brief moment. "I'm sorry. My name is Luke." He almost finished but stopped himself in time. Shmi, noticing his hesitation, insisted with a curious look. "Luke what?" Luke looked at her, feeling a strange weight as he thought about the answer. He then took a deep breath and, with a restrained smile, replied, "Just Luke." Just then, a boy suddenly ran into the house. Gasping, he said hurriedly, "Anakin, Watto is furious and wants you now. Your mother too." The atmosphere changed immediately. Shmi stood up quickly. "We have to go." Luke nodded and said calmly, "No problem. I'll be back later." Outside the house, Anakin looked at him and smiled. "See you later, Luke." Luke watched his father and grandmother for a moment, feeling that he didn't want that moment to end. Then, with a slight smile, he replied, "See you later." He looked at Shmi one last time and added, "Thanks for the talk." She smiled sweetly. "See you later, Luke." Luke then took a few steps back, watching the two of them walk away, knowing that this encounter would be marked forever. It was then that he instinctively said, "Anakin," he called out. The boy turned to face him. Luke looked at him with deep respect and added, "May the Force be with you." Anakin smiled, shook his head and continued walking alongside his mother. Luke took a deep breath and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was back in the Jedi Temple, in his body in the present moment. The experience was over, but the impact of that encounter still reverberated in his soul. Luke kept his eyes open for a while, still in a meditative position, completely paralyzed by the experience. It was all so fantastic and, at the same time, hard to believe that it could be real. But he knew it was. He could smell the place, feel the warmth of his old planet on his skin, the fine dust that mixed with the dry wind. There was no doubt about it, he really had broken the time barrier. More than that, he had come face to face with his dead father and grandmother. A unique experience, something that perhaps no other Jedi had ever experienced. With each new reflection on what had happened, Luke realized the impact of what he had done. If he was able to return to the past and interact with those who had gone before, then it meant that the past was not immutable. This thought made him shudder. If the past could be changed, then the present and future could also be rewritten. He held in his hands a power that no one else had ever had. A Jedi should never seek control over the natural events of the galaxy, But at the same time, he should not allow evil to triumph. If there was a chance to put right what had gone wrong, shouldn't he at least try? His dilemma was profound. If he interfered in the past, he could compromise the timeline and create unpredictable consequences. But what if his interference was exactly what the Force wanted? He wasn't just any Jedi, he was the last. The Jedi Order was destroyed because it failed to prevent Palpatine's rise. Had the Force allowed him to discover this ability as a last chance to prevent tragedy? Was he the Force's last card to prevent the Jedi from disappearing? These questions swirled around in his mind, making it impossible to ignore the weight of his responsibility. Luke spent days reflecting, lost in ethical and philosophical dilemmas. He thought about the Jedi teachings, the words of his masters Obi-Wan and Yoda, and the consequences of each choice. All the while, his intuition was telling him that his discovery had not been a coincidence. Nothing was by chance in the Force. Deep down, he knew the answer. He had to act. He couldn't just let everything happen the same way. He hadn't learned that technique just to satisfy his curiosity. The Force had led him to that knowledge for a reason. He had to do something that would benefit the galaxy. A few more days passed and the decision was made. He would go back in time to prevent the fall of the Republic and the Jedi Order. The suffering caused by the Emperor and his apprentice, Darth Vader, could not continue. But the big question was, how would he do it? At what point would he return? He couldn't just arrive and warn the Jedi Council. If the Masters of the Order themselves didn't realize Palpatine's threat in his time, it was unlikely that they would accept the word of an outsider, even more so one who claimed to come from the future. He had to be strategic. It was then that a memory came to mind, his first experience in the past. He didn't go back to any moment, he didn't see any random event in history. He went back to see his father, Anakin Skywalker. This couldn't be just chance. The Force had guided him straight to the heart of it all. If there was a way to change the fate of the galaxy, it was through Anakin, the chosen one, the one responsible for bringing balance to the Force. Perhaps the key to preventing the rise of the Empire lay precisely in convincing Anakin not to fall to the dark side. Luke remembered how his father saved him, destroying the Emperor and restoring justice to the galaxy. He had seen him redeem himself at the last moment, defeating the dark side and sacrificing himself to destroy Palpatine. But what if he had done it before? What if, in another time, he could convince Anakin to destroy the Emperor before everything happened? He knew this mission wouldn't be simple. Palpatine was cunning, manipulative, and had poisoned his father's mind little by little. But Luke had something that no one else had: knowledge of the future. If he showed Anakin what would happen, if he made him see the cruel fate that awaited him, he could convince him not to give in to fear and anger. He trusted that, faced with the truth, his father would make the right choice. He believed that Anakin, seeing with his own eyes the suffering his fall would cause, would find the strength to resist. Luke was determined. He would go back in time, find Anakin at the most critical moment and stop him from falling. But what Luke hadn't imagined was that things would be much more complicated. Luke closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the Force flow freely through his body. He had already understood that he didn't need to know the exact date to return to the right moment. He just needed to feel the scene in his mind, visualize the ideal moment, and allow the Force to guide him. The connection he had with his father was strong, and he knew that wherever Anakin was at that crucial time, he would find him. So, focusing on his intention to speak to his father before his final fall, Luke gave himself over to the technique and let the Force decide where to take him. After a few minutes in a deep meditative state, Luke heard voices echoing around him. It was as if he were in a closed but busy environment. He slowly opened his eyes and realized he was in a long, well-lit corridor. There was an air of formality about it, a sophisticated and austere structure. He recognized the architecture almost instantly. He was possibly inside a building in Coruscant, most likely the Senate or some administrative complex. The game had begun. Walking slowly through the corridors, Luke relied entirely on the Force to guide him. Every step he took, he felt the vibration around him, the energy of that time pulsating intensely. As always, he touched the walls to check his intangibility, and Indeed, he still had no solid physical form. However, he noticed that people passing by could see him, even if some simply looked away, taking no notice. He was a Jedi at the time, and his presence didn't cause any strangeness. That was when he received his first impact. As he crossed a side corridor, he came upon a huge glass wall that revealed the breathtaking landscape of Coruscant before the fall of the Republic. The city was vibrant, magnificent, full of life, a civilization at its peak, still without the shadows of the Empire covering its skies. Luke stood still for a moment, absorbing the scene. Even knowing what was coming next, he couldn't help but admire the grandeur of that world, about to collapse under Palpatine's manipulation. Then a shiver ran down his spine. He felt a strong presence, a powerful and familiar energy. He didn't have to look for long. When he turned around, he saw Anakin Skywalker walking down the corridor, wearing his black Jedi robes. He was hurrying, his countenance heavy, his expression tense. But what struck Luke most was the intensity of the Force around him. It was something enormous, something that not even Darth Vader or his master, Yoda, possessed. He finally understood why his father was the chosen one. No other being in the galaxy emanated so much energy. Anakin continued walking in a hurry, without noticing Luke immediately. Luke then decided to follow him and get closer. As he walked, he saw his father's imposing stature up close. He was strong, young, and at the top of his game. Noticing Luke's presence, Anakin slowed down slightly and frowned. Looking at the stranger's Jedi robes, he realized that he was going to be approached, but he kept his composure. Luke took a deep breath and, to prevent Anakin from attempting a greeting, held his hands back and bowed his head respectfully. "Are you Anakin Skywalker?" asked Luke, his voice firm and calm. Anakin replied with a brief nod. "Yes. Have we met?" There was a tone of suspicion in Anakin's voice. After all, he had never seen this Jedi before. Luke kept his expression calm and replied, "Yes, but you mustn't remember. I need to speak to you urgently, in private." Anakin narrowed his eyes. "Can we reschedule? I'm in a real hurry." Luke didn't know it, but his father had just come out of a crucial conversation with Palpatine. The Sith Lord had told him about Darth Plagueis and hinted that Padme could be saved from death through the dark side. Anakin's mind was in chaos, filled with doubt and fear. Luke sensed his father's emotional turmoil and knew he had to be quick. "I imagine this isn't a good time," said Luke, "but the matter is really urgent, and it's in your interest." Anakin took a deep breath, but his mind was dominated by Palpatine's promise. "It's not a good time," he replied, starting to walk away. "Look for me later." Luke knew that if he let Anakin go, he would lose his chance. So, without hesitation, he played the only card that could get his father's attention. "It's about Padme." Anakin stopped immediately. His body went rigid and, for a few seconds, the corridor seemed to plunge into absolute silence. Slowly, he turned and cast an intense gaze at Luke, his eyes sparking. "What did you say?" Luke remained calm, holding his father's gaze. "What I have to tell you involves Padme. I've had some visions. It was a lie, but a necessary one." He knew that Anakin was impulsive, and the only way to establish contact was to make his father believe that they had something in common. And it worked for a moment. Anakin looked at him curiously, but then his gaze turned suspicious. "How do you know about Padme?" His hand went to his lightsaber. "Who are you really?" Luke saw the tension in his father's eyes and knew that any wrong answer could lead to conflict. But he didn't want any kind of confrontation, and Anakin needed to feel that. With a slight smile and a calm tone, Luke replied, "I would never hurt you. Least of all Padme." Luke's words came as a shock to Anakin. His body relaxed slightly, and the look of fury gave way to an expression of uncertainty. There was something about that unknown Jedi that seemed real, something that made him feel that he wasn't facing an enemy. Anakin didn't understand why, but for a brief moment, he felt that, strangely, he could trust him. His emotional block was broken by Luke's peaceful energy. Anakin took a deep breath, trying to understand the mixture of emotions he was feeling. Something inside him told him that the mysterious Jedi had something important to say. After a few seconds of silence, he finally gave in. "All right." His eyes remained fixed on Luke's. "Come with me." Anakin led Luke to a private room inside the building, a place he knew well and where they could talk without interruption. As soon as they entered, Anakin closed the door and turned to him, crossing his arms. His face was serious, but also full of curiosity. "So, what do you have to tell me that's so important?" she asked, trying to keep her patience. Luke felt a chill run down his spine. This was the moment. There was no turning back. He had to reveal the truth and, above all, convince his father that it was real. Luke began with a question. "Do you remember when you were a child and a Jedi visited you at home? You and your mother?" Anakin frowned, trying to remember. "Yes, you're talking about when I met Master Qui-Gon. He was the one who set me free," he replied, with a slightly nostalgic tone. Luke shook his head and corrected him. "Before that, probably before Master Qui-Gon. A Jedi who said he had broken his ship. Your mother invited him in." Anakin's eyes widened in surprise. "Yes, I remember. But how do you know that?" he asked, now puzzled. Luke watched him carefully and asked another question. "Do you remember that Jedi's face?" Anakin narrowed his eyes and scratched his chin, trying to recall the distant memory. "I don't think so. It's been a long time. I only saw him once. But how do you know the story?" Luke smiled slightly and asked in a relaxed manner. "And his name? Do you remember it?" Anakin was still trying to remember, but Luke jumped in and said, "Luke. His name was Luke." Anakin, surprised by the memory, said, "Yes, I think that was his name," he confirmed, now beginning to feel uneasy. Luke then concluded, bringing up the final detail. "Before he left and never came back," he said, "May the Force be with you." Anakin's eyes widened even more. He remained static for a moment, as if his mind was trying to reorganize events. He stared at Luke and asked with incredulity in his voice, "How do you know that?" Luke kept his composure and answered firmly, "Because it was me. I was that Jedi. My name is Luke." Anakin stared at Luke with an intense gaze, unable to fully understand. How could that be possible? Luke seemed to be the same age as him, perhaps a little older, but he certainly wasn't someone who could have been on Tatooine when he was still a child. None of it made sense. Luke noticed the confusion in his eyes and knew he had to prove that he wasn't an imposter. "Studying ancient techniques, I learned to project my consciousness beyond my physical body. My body isn't really here," Luke said calmly. To demonstrate, he stretched out his hand and walked through the wall. Anakin took a step back, clearly astonished by what he saw. Luke smiled slightly and said, "See for yourself." Then he stretched out his arm. Anakin hesitated for a moment, but reached out to touch it. When his fingers passed through Luke as if he were made of air, he stepped back in surprise. For the first time since the conversation began, Anakin smiled, albeit in a restrained way. "Where is your body then?" asked Anakin, now showing a little more curiosity than skepticism. "It's a long way from here," replied Luke. "But that's not all. I've also learned to project my consciousness, not only in space but also in time." Anakin raised his eyebrows, visibly impressed. "So you can visit the past?" Luke nodded. "Yes, I'm doing it now." Anakin paused for a moment, his gaze distant, as if he were trying to process it all. Then, suddenly, his eyes returned to Luke and he asked with frightening seriousness, "Are you telling me that you come from the future?" Luke confirmed, "Yes." Silence hung in the air for a few seconds. Anakin looked away and began pacing back and forth, trying to process everything. Luke knew he had to continue before his father rejected the idea completely. "I'm here to talk to you," said Luke, breaking the silence. Anakin stopped and stared at him. "Why? Why with me? Why with me?" "For two reasons," replied Luke. "First, because you're the chosen one. The one the prophecy says will bring balance to the Force." Anakin frowned. This was a delicate subject for him. He had spent years hearing about this prophecy, but had never known exactly what it meant. He never knew what to do with this responsibility. Luke paused and then continued, "And also, because from your worried look, I know and feel that Padme is already pregnant." Anakin stopped immediately and his breathing became heavy. His mind was in complete chaos. He knew that Padme was expecting a child, but he hadn't told anyone. How could that strange Jedi know? Luke noticed Anakin's tension and softened his tone. I know it's hard to accept, but I believe that the Force brought me here to fix everything. Fix it? Anakin repeated, confused. What's happened? Is she going to be all right? Luke bowed his head for a moment. He felt the weight of the truth he was about to reveal. Then he looked up and said, the second reason I came to you is that maybe only I can do something I did in the future, and I'll try to do it again before it all happens. Anakin approached, now showing a mixture of anxiety and fear. What's going to happen? Luke looked directly into his father's eyes. The child in Padme's belly. He paused, feeling the tension in the air. I am that baby. Anakin was completely paralyzed. His eyes were vacant, his mind struggling to grasp the implications of those words. My name is Luke Skywalker. I am your son. Anakin was speechless. The phrase echoed inside his mind like thunder. He felt a chill run down his spine and, without realizing it, muttered the same words that Vader would say to Luke years later. Are you my son? The confusion was immense. Anakin felt his heart racing. He ended up repeating exactly what Luke would say to him in the future. Instinctively, he denied it. No, that's not possible. Can't be. Luke kept a calm, steady gaze. Search your feelings. You know it's true. The weight of the revelation began to sink into Anakin. He put his hand to his head, trying to pull himself together. Luke stepped forward and added, now I understand why the Force took me to Tatooine. It was to make you believe. And maybe it was also a gift. Anakin, still lost in thought, raised his eyes and saw Luke looking at him with a nostalgic gleam. Then he realized that he wasn't just talking about himself. She was so beautiful, said Luke, with a sad smile. Anakin felt a tightness in his chest. He knew exactly who Luke was talking about. He was talking about his mother, Shmi Skywalker. And at that moment, for the first time, Anakin began to accept that Luke was telling the truth. Anakin remained silent, watching Luke intently as he tried to process everything he had just heard. He was standing in front of his own son. The idea seemed impossible, but at the same time, something inside him told him it was true. He looked at Luke and saw subtle similarities in their features, but more than that, he felt a deep connection that he had never experienced before. Luke seemed so sure, so convinced, and the way he spoke aroused a strange feeling in him, something that mixed admiration and silent fear. Coming back to reality and remembering his greatest concern, Anakin looked at Luke anxiously and asked, but you still haven't answered me. Padme, will she be all right? Luke bowed his head again. He knew that this would be the most difficult moment of the conversation. After a sigh, he replied regretfully, no, she'll die during childbirth. Anakin's breathing became labored. He took a step back and closed his eyes tightly, as if trying to deny the information. So my visions are real. It's going to happen, he murmured, feeling the despair growing inside him. He already knew. Deep down, he had always known that those images in his nightmares were real, but to have it confirmed by someone who claimed to come from the future was an overwhelming blow. Luke, standing firm, looked into his father's eyes and said with conviction, no, she won't. I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen. Anakin raised his eyes to Luke, his breathing still ragged, but now there was a different gleam in them, a spark of hope. How? He asked, almost begging for an answer. Luke stepped forward and spoke calmly. But to do that, you have to do exactly what I say. Anakin nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Luke, showing that he was ready to listen. Palpatine, Luke continued. He's the cause of all the problems that will befall the galaxy and our family from now on. He's not who you think he is. He's a Sith Lord, and he's going to use you to become Emperor. Anakin took another step back, his mind immediately recalling the conversation he had just had with Palpatine. He had left hoping to save Padme, believing that the Chancellor really wanted to help him. But now Luke was saying the opposite. His mind began to conflict. The Chancellor? It can't be. He's trying to help me, he said, his voice laden with doubt. Luke shook his head, standing his ground. No, he's using you. That's all. Anakin began to pace back and forth, trying to organize his thoughts. It was all too much information, and he felt increasingly confused. Luke continued, "You need to do two things. Warn the Council about Palpatine and, immediately afterwards, get Padme and take her to Naboo. Don't leave there until your children are born." Anakin stopped walking and looked at Luke, confused. "Your children?" Luke realized he had said too much and quickly corrected himself. "Forget it. Just go there." Anakin wanted to dwell on that detail, but his mind was in chaos. His focus returned to the decision he needed to make. Should he alert the Council? Should he just abandon everything and run away with Padme? "But I can't do that," said Anakin, shaking his head. "The Council needs me. I must be part of it." Luke saw his father's internal conflict. Anakin was torn between his fear of losing Padme and his pride as a Jedi. He wanted to prove his worth, he wanted to be recognized, he wanted to be at the center of events. But Luke knew that, deep down, the real problem was that Anakin still didn't want to accept that Palpatine was the enemy. "Dad, you have to do this," said Luke, almost pleading. Anakin looked at him, his eyes filled with doubt and fear. "I can't, Luke." Deep down, Anakin still couldn't completely break free from Palpatine's influence. Part of him wanted to believe that the Chancellor could be his only hope of saving Padme. If something happened to Palpatine, would he still have any chance of preventing his loss? Pacing back and forth, Anakin finally stopped and made a decision. "All right, I'll do as you ask, but only after Palpatine is safe." Luke lowered his head, feeling a weight on his chest. He didn't know exactly how things had turned out until his father fell to the dark side. He didn't know to what extent his interference had altered the course of events. But at that moment, he felt he had done everything he could. "It's all right. It's up to you," said Luke, accepting his father's wishes. "I hope that was enough. But remember, never give in to hatred. There's always a way back. I've seen it happen. And I believe you." Anakin looked at Luke with emotion. He didn't know why, but he felt that this Jedi was unlike anyone he had ever met. A strong bond formed between the two of them, even if he was still struggling to accept the truth. For a moment, Anakin smiled slightly. Luke noticed and returned the gesture. Then he repeated the words he had said to little Anakin on Tatooine. "May the Force be with you, Anakin." This time, Anakin not only smiled, but felt a strange warmth in his chest, something he had never felt before. He then replied, "May the Force be with you, Luke." Luke closed his eyes, feeling that his mission had been completed. And, before Anakin's astonished eyes, he disappeared. Anakin stood still, watching the scene in amazement, not knowing exactly how to process everything that had just happened. Luke's words echoed in his mind, and he knew that his life would never be the same. Anakin wasted no time and immediately went to the Jedi Council to inform Mace Windu of Palpatine's true identity. He spoke firmly, stating that the Chancellor was a Sith Lord and had been manipulating the Republic for years. "You did well to warn us, Skywalker," said Windu. "But now you must wait here in the Council chamber while we sort this out." Anakin frowned. "But Master, I can help. You've helped enough by bringing this information. Now let us deal with him," said Windu, ending the discussion. Anakin tried to insist, but Windu was unyielding. He gathered the available Jedi Masters and set off to confront Palpatine. Meanwhile, Anakin remained in the temple, restless, staring at the Coruscant sunset. His mind was divided. He had warned the Jedi, but what about Padme? If something happened to Palpatine, would he lose any chance of saving her? The anguish grew until it became unbearable. He had to make sure that nothing happened to the Chancellor. Following his instincts, Anakin mounted his speeder and set off in the direction of Palpatine's office. When he arrived, he found a chaotic scene. The Jedi Masters had been killed, leaving only Mace Windu, who was fighting a fierce duel with Palpatine. The old Sith was trapped, his energy draining away, while Windu raised his saber to deliver the final blow. "He's too dangerous to be left alive," declared Windu. It was at that moment that Anakin made his decision. Without thinking, He drew his saber and, with a single blow, cut off Windu's hand before he could execute Palpatine. The Jedi Master cried out in pain and retreated. Palpatine, seizing the opportunity, raised his hands and launched a devastating force bolt at Windu, pushing him towards the window. But before Windu could be thrown to his death, a voice echoed through the room. "No!" Anakin turned in surprise to see his son, Luke Skywalker, standing in the center of the room. Luke raised his hand and used the Force to pull Windu's body inwards, away from the window and preventing his fatal fall. When Luke returned to his own time, he saw that nothing had changed. Concentrating on the Force, he decided to return to the moment when the Force was guiding him. "What are you doing here?" asked Anakin, confused. Luke didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on Palpatine, filled with fury. "You're not going to destroy my family again," declared Luke. Then he reached out and began to strangle Palpatine from a distance. The Sith gasped, trying to free himself from the invisible force crushing his throat. "Help me, Anakin!" shouted Palpatine, trying to reach his former ally. Anakin was paralyzed. What was he supposed to do? He looked at Palpatine and then at Luke, seeing his son seized by uncontrollable rage. "Stop it, Luke," he asked, not knowing how to react. But Luke didn't give in. "He has to die. He'll destroy everything." Palpatine, sensing Anakin's hesitation, gathered his last strength and fired his Force beams at Luke. Even though it was a projection, Luke felt the pain coursing through his physical body from a distance. Just as he was able to access the Force, Palpatine's rays, also coming from the Force, reached him. The impact was overwhelming. Luke fell to his knees and his form began to tremble. "Father, you have to kill him," shouted Luke, trying to resist the lightning. Anakin looked at Palpatine and then at his son, who was writhing in pain. "Stop that," Anakin ordered the Sith. But Palpatine didn't stop. He laughed sadistically, increasing the intensity of his attack on Luke. Windu, still weak, mustered the strength to speak. "Anakin, kill him," Luke added. "Father, help me." Anakin's eyes widened. His mind was seized by memories. His mother dying in his arms. It all flashed through his mind in an instant, and then he knew. He finally knew what the right choice was. With a cry of fury, Anakin activated his saber and, without hesitation, plunged the blade into Palpatine's chest. The Sith's body contorted as the electricity of his own rays consumed him. In the darkness, Anakin heard one last gasp before Palpatine collapsed to the floor, dead. The room fell silent. Windu sat down, exhausted. Luke, still weak, felt his connection to that time begin to unravel. He looked at his father, breathless but relieved. Now, in another timeline, Anakin once again brought balance to the Force. But this time, he survived. Mace Windu survived. The Jedi in the temple survived and Order 66 was never activated. All thanks to the sacrifice and intervention of his son, Luke Skywalker. Anakin left immediately and went to Padme. Luke, still projected, followed him without him noticing. For the first time, he saw his mother up close. She was alive, well, hugging Anakin with relief and love. Luke felt a tightness in his chest, but also a peace he had never felt before. His mission was accomplished, so he closed his eyes and let the Force take him back. When he opened his eyes, Luke was no longer in his usual spot in a distant Jedi temple. He wasn't in a position of meditation. He was lying in a Jedi temple lodge on Coruscant. Confused, he got up and looked around. Everything seemed different. He got up, walked over to a mirror and saw his own reflection. His age was the same, but something inside him seemed to have changed. Leaving the room, he walked through the temple. Jedi passed him by, greeting him as if he were one of them. Luke was stunned. Then, as he turned down a corridor, he saw Anakin Skywalker. His father had a beard, longer hair, and looked 20 years older. "Father," murmured Luke. Anakin smiled at the sight of him. "I've been waiting for you to wake up, son." Luke didn't know what to say. Was all this real? Anakin noticed his confusion and put a hand on his shoulder. "Everything you experienced was real. You saved us." Luke felt a weight come off his shoulders. Then, as he walked through the temple, he realized that his mind was beginning to be filled with memories that weren't his own. But at the same time, they were. He was assimilating a new timeline, slowly remembering a reality where his mother survived, where the Jedi Order never fell, where his father never became Darth Vader. He then saw his mother, Padme Amidala, now Chancellor of the Republic, and his father, Anakin Skywalker, Grand Master of the Jedi Order. Luke then closed his eyes and smiled with relief. He had made it, and this time his family was complete.